carbon market is growing in popularity as our economy edges closer to decarbonisation targets. Jarden's head of Commodities, Nigel Brunel, is a pioneer in carbon trading and is here to help explain it for us. Thanks so much for joining us, Nigel.
Good to be here.
Could you please explain for us what the emissions trading scheme is and what it's aiming to achieve?
Yeah, so the ETS or emissions trading scheme is New Zealand's central mechanism for dealing with climate change. If you're going to bring a price of carbon into your economy, you're going to do it one of two ways, either as a carbon tax or as an emissions trading scheme. New Zealand has a range of emissions, so generally an ETS is seen as kind of the better model, but it's a way for New Zealand to sort of price carbon internally as it deals with international targets under the Paris Agreement and also getting towards net zero by 2050.
What or who determines the number of units allocated into the market to be traded?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complex in that regard, but New Zealand obviously wants to get to a net zero target by 2050. So it's no different than a household budget. When you want to achieve a goal, there's a descending desire for our emissions to go lower. So we kind of have what's known as an emissions cap, and then the government wants to set supply into that market relative to that cap that it wants to see that descend, or like a sinking lid. So with the use of the Climate Change Commission, which is like a central body, independent body that the government's put in place to help them work out what policy is and unit settings and limits and those kind of things, that too basically helps set the limits for the government, so that as that sinking lid goes lower, the supply relative to that cap comes into play.
And who trades carbon units? And is it voluntary or is it mandatory?
Well, we are kind of talking about two different markets there, right? So obviously in the compliance market, which is what we're just talking about in regards to an ETS, the liable entities that are caught up within that, think of it like a market-based tax, like a government construct, where certain entities of certain sizes, where there might be coal-fired power stations or burning coal or using fuel, are sort of caught up by the ETS relative to the amount of emissions that they create, and they have to account for those emissions every year and then hand allowances to the government at the end of every year in order to comply with that ETS or that compliance market. On the other side is the voluntary market. That's kind of everybody else. Companies that want to go about, dealing with their own personal emissions and within their company will look at those emissions, verify what they are, work out how they want to reduce those emissions, because it really is about the reduction process of emissions. Then often they'll be left with a balance because no one can really get to zero. And that's where they buy carbon offsets to sort of neutralise that amount of emissions they can't reduce. And that's known as the voluntary market, which is different to compliance. But again, how corporates and even individuals can go around offsetting their own emissions.
The price of carbon has appreciated since the ETS was created. What's influenced that and where do you see that price going?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think if you think about what a carbon price is kind of set to do, carbon markets are very different than normal markets. If you think about financial markets, they kind of go on forever. Stock markets, foreign exchange markets, commodity markets. But when you think about a carbon market or a price on carbon, it's actually there for a purpose, to effectively reduce carbon, out of the economy, effectively completely gone, right? So the price of carbon needs to be at a level that causes or forces those that are producing those emissions to effectively move off that kind of energy onto renewable energy. So a price of carbon sort of allows the introduction of other forms of generation like solar and like wind and like EVs and things like that. So I think, where the price is going to go, it's always a hard question to kind of answer. But I think if you look out at what some international bodies are saying, like the OECD, IMF, World Bank, are kind of saying, if you want to be net zero by 2050, then your price of carbon by 2030 probably needs to be in the vicinity of like $150 to $200 a tonne by 2030. And we're kind of halfway there at the moment.
Given the ETS is a government policy, what are the possible risks it could face?
Yeah, so obviously with any government construct, there's always regulatory risk, right? And that's the number one thing that our emissions trading scheme has. New Zealand's kind of lucky because, the climate policy has been like a bipartisan, tripartisan right across the floor of Parliament. So even though you might find different governments of the day might go at a slightly different speed, the direction and the policy is not really going to be subject to that much change. But having said that, this is a complex problem to solve, and I think like any policy or any sort of thing that you have in place to try and deal with that will need changes from time to time, and that's not necessarily to do with the government, but just necessarily to do with, well, we need to change this slightly and improve that slightly, and that's the kind of regulatory risk that you get within an emissions trading scheme.